Hi folks, I didn't know about the artist. There was this other guy who is an Alan Hirsch who does something to do with smells. He's kind of a scientist, might be that neuroscientist dude, but he's interested in how things work in your smell region. He wrote a book about how to get better on your dates by having the right smells on you or something like that. It's definitely not me. Well, folks, it's always an honor to be able to speak to a group like you. I do believe that you guys are the people who uphold and are the front line of the church. You're kind of people who are doing it, and you're my heroes, and I exist in so many ways to serve you and to give my life, to people like yourself. So it is an honor to be here. I do have a funny accent. I do come from Australia, born in South Africa, so it gets a little weird. And probably you're going to struggle to hear some or understand some of the things I have to say, but hopefully most of it will be understood. I do come in some sense from your future, and I mean that by in the church in Australia, where I've spent most of my life. The church is all but gone. It's pretty much disappeared off the kind of the scene of Australian kind of cultural life. Don't believe Hillsong in this regard. I mean, I have great respect for it, but we're very, very small. I'm going to share some statistics with you a little later on. We're almost non-existent as a movement, as a force for good. And I say that with great grief, but in a sense, I come in a sense with a sense of the burden for the American church, believing that the American church, in a sense, as far as the church in the West is concerned, carries the burden, and also that if we can win the battle for the church over here, and we can turn the boat around here, we win right across the Western world. So I believe that these are kind of momentous times in which we live, and it's kind of very important that we think very clearly about what we do. It's odd that I be speaking at a facilities conference. For some who might know me, I don't expect that many have read, but my first book, written with Michael Frost, The Shaping of Things to Come, was something of a shot across the bow of the church in the West. In terms of how we prioritize things, and often people read us as being quite strongly anti-mega church or against buildings and all that stuff, which is entirely wrong, because in many ways I've had a deep and abiding love and respect for mega churches, particularly the ones who genuinely are representing, doing the best to represent Jesus in our time. But it is ironic, because certainly we did raise a few questions about how we allocate our resources. And I believe it's appropriate to ask those questions, particularly in conferences like this, where you get to choose and spend the money of the church. I just remind us here that a budget, my friends, is a theological statement. It's how you allocate your wealth and your resources is a statement of theology. It's about what you value. It's a missiological statement. It kind of shows your priorities to yourself, but also to the congregations that we lead, and beyond that to the broader church. We shape our buildings, says Churchill said this, but McLuhan picks up on it. Churchill said, we shape our buildings and then they shape us. We shape our tools and then they shape us. That was McLuhan's interpretation of that. And in so many ways, we need to learn how to shape. Let's spend, but let's spend wisely. My friend Ed Baylor, who's here somewhere, tells me that about the church in America alone spends $70 billion every decade on plant and resources in the church. $70 billion per decade. Now, just factor that into the fact that we are in decline right across the Western world, including in this country. The church is definitely on the back foot. So $70 billion is a lot of money to spend on decline. And we can, of course, use that money more wisely, from your family experience. So what I want to do today is to paint a very broad picture with a broad brushstroke, a kind of a macro view, a macro view, if you will, but with the idea of being able to interpret our lives and our experiences within local church within the bigger picture. And like I said, I come to some degree from your future in this regard, and I hope that America makes the right decisions. I think the signs are very good. So let me paint that picture. To do this, I'm going to look like a bit of a mad scientist. I've got some sort of drawing program here. And I'm going to do a lot of whiteboard kind of stuff. And then there's a bit of Q&A at the end. so that we can maybe throw some kind of stuff around, if you will. To do this, I'm going to layer some concepts over each other and see where it takes us to help us kind of get a good look at what we're doing. The first concept that I want to do is a thing called cultural distance. Tell me if this is working. Don't you love technology? Well, I'm among all the geeks here, I guess. My kind of people. I love tools. So cultural distance, that's not very well spelt, but it's kind of doesn't look that sexy, but it's there. Cultural distance was developed by a guy called Ralph Winter, and it's a very simple idea that goes like this: is that he put this line over here. Let me just empty this and just go here. He put this line with 4 numbers on it: 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And he put a little E next to it, I put a little M next to it, but it doesn't matter. Each number indicates one significant barrier to the meaningful communication of the gospel. It's important to get that. Each number represents a significant barrier, cultural barrier, to the meaningful communication of the gospel. So, if you were going overseas or cross-culturally into another context, what would be a significant cultural barrier? Everyone's going to say language, right? Language is number one. Because if I said to you that you had to learn a new language in order to communicate the gospel meaningfully, it's got a little harder on you. Everyone agree? Now, it's a big group, but let me play this out for you and to say, if you think in your mind now 3 or 4 others, big cultural barriers, what might they be? Keep them in your mind. Let me suggest some to you because we won't get space to kind of get the feedback. So language, we said, is one, right? So language. I would suggest another one would be religion or worldview. If you're now crossing a language barrier and a worldview barrier or religious barrier, it's got now increasingly harder again. Exponentially harder, I would argue. So you've got maybe religion. Another one would be race or history, because one's racial history, one's narrative as a nation, shapes oneself very, very deeply. It's interesting how different the Canadians are to the US. Their story is fundamentally different, and they are a significantly different nation, even though you guys live right next to each other. And to my ears, you sound like each other, but I know that's not quite true. So get that in your mind. So now, if you are from 0, right? You're operating from 0, is that up there? And you're now kind of hanging around in 3 and 4, you are probably in Saudi Arabia, where the church has had hardly any effect at all. Over centuries and millennia of missions to that continent country. We haven't really had an impact upon them. Because it's very difficult over there, right? So now it's easy to see this in cross-cultural missions overseas. What I want to suggest to you folks is this, is that in our own context, here back in the US, it's all gone and shifted in this direction on us. The church that we inhabit pretty much sits at 0 over here and is reasonably effective because the idea that we've got, the idea of church, the way let me use that word over here, I'm going to write the word idea of church, the concept of church that we inherited came from the European experience of church. Now, the church in Europe was formed primarily in the early time, in the kind of apostolic period, in the post-apostolic up to the year 300, was largely a kind of what I call an apostolic movement. At the point when Constantine comes in, something fundamental shifts. He marries church and state. The church is taken from the margins and put right at the center of society. Within hundreds of years now, the church is now the epicenter, at the cultural epicenter of all society right across Europe. So much so that the bond was absolutely kind of married, fused together by the time it comes to America. Now, America breaks the church-state relationship, but to still be an American is to be a Christian. So now the sense of the privileged status of the church now bonds itself to our sense of national identity. Now, why I say all this, and again it sounds all theoretical, is because the way we think about church, the idea of church, comes out of a privileged situation where the church has a strong reach, a strong connection with its culture around about us. In Europe, like I said, when you were born in say, year 1000, most people were born Christians. That is, you came out of the womb and you were baptized into the faith. Most people, 90-something%, would have been Christian people. They were the Jews and the Gypsies and all the other, very few marginalized and persecuted groups, but they were largely on the edge of town. To be an American 50 years ago, we largely was Christian. There were some others, but it wasn't really a big a deal. So the way we do church basically has come out of that. Most of our theology books, the way we kind of conceptualized it, has been formulated in a certain era and really is set very, very deeply into our consciousness. The problem, as I say over here, is that the church, while its privileged situation is still there to some degree in the US, the thing is changing upon us. Like as I mentioned over here, it's shifting across this scale over here, right? It's going into this 2, 3s, and 4s. Even though it's not in a cross-cultural setting, it's definitely happening. Atlanta would be a good example of it. Atlanta 20 years ago was a very different city than it is today. And I would suggest it's much harder now in communicating the gospel, even to a place like Atlanta, which traditionally part of the South has had a large influence, where most people within the cultural orbit of the church. Everyone with me so far? You can ask Q&A if you want a little later on if I haven't been clear enough about it. Now, where's that? Now, what I want to do here is to kind of highlight a few things about this. For one, let's assume, let me put this person here, there's someone over here in 2 and 3 distance from us, right? Now, someone in this church over here happens to be relating very strongly to this person, might be in a work situation. They are a good evangelist, they bring this person to the Lord. Let's say it's a Jewish homosexual, twice removed from the existing church as we know it. The Jewishness, the gay kind of issue is a huge issue for gay people. So let's assume this person comes to the Lord. What is the natural response at that point? What do we do when someone becomes a Christian? The natural thing is to invite them into your community, isn't it right? To come back to church. Now, so that's natural, right? So what we do is we bring them back to church. The problem is that most churches, and particularly very good ones, are very, very good socializing agencies. We socialize people into their context. Let's assume this is a pretty good one, right? And so there's a whole new set of friends. It's a vibrant church, a whole new cultural system. The person then becomes part of the church community. The problem is with this is that we know that within 3 to 5 years, this is very old statistics, folks. So I would say it's 15, 20 years ago. I don't know what it would be today, but this is researched about that time. Within 3 to 5 years of a person becoming a believer, they will no longer have any significant relationships with people outside of the church. Within 3 to 5 years, we socialize them into our church. Now that ordinarily would be all right, if your idea of church assumed that you were the center of society and that everyone was within your cultural orbit, that you didn't have to reach beyond yourself to kind of make an impact for the gospel. In other words, it's all right if everyone is within the cultural orbit of the church. The problem is that in a missionary environment, which this is now, in a missionary environment, if you operate attractionally, in other words, the expectation is you come to us to hear the gospel. You come to us to be nurtured in the faith. In a missionary environment, you effectively extract them. Attractional in a missionary environment, in a missional environment, is extractional. And here's the problem. We know that the gospel spreads primarily along relational lines. In other words, by extracting this person from their normal set of relationships over here, we extract their capacity to influence via the gospel's kind of capacity to influence via their kind of natural kind of relationships is thereby damaged. Do you see the problem there? No? Yes. Okay. Now let me close that down for a while, and I'm just going to put that little kind of image up there. That's the first concept. I want you to hold it in your mind, because I want you to see that as a very big picture over here, because what is happening right across the Western world is a massive fragmentation of society and the subculturalization, all that stuff that goes along with it, which creates the kind of conditions which I've been speaking about there. I'm not a statistician or the son of one, but I was invited to interpret a whole lot of statistics back in my country in Australia. It was done by a thing called National Church Life Survey, very well funded. A few really big buildings closed down, churches closed down, and they gave their money to this research agency to do a kind of research like a census of the church over 15, 20 years. It was amazing because every 5 years they would take a photograph of the church and then they would track the trends and all that stuff. Very, very significant stuff. I believe their best work was done in between the 5 years, in one of the times when they had nothing to do, but they had this whole apparatus that was at their fingertips, and they decided to do a whole lot of research into kind of attitudes among non-Christian people about a number of issues. These were the issues that they looked at were the issues of God, Jesus, spirituality, and the church. They were the broad categories. There were a lot of subcategories on it. And this was a very large sample of the population, so we'd get a very clear picture of what people thought about these things. Now, I've got to tell you that Australia, as I've already mentioned, is a very, very secular country. Much, much more so than here, more like Europe, and for different reasons. So these statistics are somewhat surprising. Now, I'm going to reflect the Aussie statistics, but I want you to kind of interact with me, if you will. This is positive, okay? That maybe, and that's negative, okay? So I want you to kind of, each of you to kind of respond when I ask you to do this. I'll give you the Aussie reflection. I want you to think for your own context, right? What do you think most Aussies in the sample, what did they think about God? Now remember, like we thought that this is like a secular country, right? So what do you think most Americans think about God? Do they believe in God? Now, I need to say out here at this point, move away from the kind of dogmatic categories of Trinity or distinctively Christian understanding. We talk about a generic idea of God, higher power, whatever you want to call it, cosmic principle, any of those kinds of things, he or she, doesn't matter at this point. Do people believe in something greater than themselves with power in the universe? Positives. Maybes? Negatives. Yeah, you're right, actually. So the most what I can tell you, in fact, even in Australia, it came up very, very highly. Mostly about 90% of people believe in God. About 75% claim to pray on a regular basis, which is really quite remarkable. And it was a surprise. So actually, the God issue comes up quite well. Jesus. Again, you can ask this for yourselves. What do most people think about Jesus in Australia, in America? What do you think about Jesus? Positives? Maybes? There's a few maybes there. Negatives? No negatives, okay? So here's the thing. Jesus in my country came up very, very well, again, and I suggest in your country as well. I was trained in marketing and advertising, and what they do in marketing and advertising is to sell products, advertisers need to get their product or their brand into what they call the perceived set. The perceived set is the top three, the perceived set is three brands within a given product line. So the aim is that when people go shopping, they will usually choose from within the perceived set, that is within the top three. Most people can only remember 3 or 4 if you're a very discerning shopper. So for instance, if I ask someone here, if I ask this gentleman over here, sitting over there, and no one's to help him, if I said, you've got to give me the top 3 in this product line, you willing to do this? Toothpaste, no one's to help him, okay? Toothpaste, name quickly. Chris Colgate. That's good. Okay, so he's given me 2, and he probably would press out number 3. I've counted on your shelves, there's about 12, 13 of them available in most supermarkets. Now he will choose from that. Here's my suggestion to you folks. That if you ask the question, who's the greatest person who ever lived, to your neighbor next door, they might be a non-Christian person, I want to take a bet. We Aussies bet. We do wagering. On occasion, I don't particularly do it, but I would bet on this one, right? I would, because I think it's sure money. I would bet that the person next door would put Jesus in the top 3 every time. 100% hit. Top 3 perceived set. I would go a little further and put better odds on to say that he's going to come up number 1, because folks, here's the question. Who else are you going to put in there? Mother Teresa, right? Someone going to say Mother Teresa? Yes. Mother Teresa looks to Jesus. Who else? Gandhi. Gandhi looks to Jesus. Actually, he comes to his insights by reading Leo Tolstoy's exposition on the Sermon on the Mount. And he claims to be a follower of Jesus to some, and he pretty much draws his insight from there. Who else are you going to put in there? Muhammad? Well, you don't want to go on vacation with Muhammad. I think. I won't. A little bit of a bad temper, I think. so I'm not going to go. The ultimate thing is I'd love to go on vacation with Jesus. That's me, I love Jesus. Okay, so Jesus comes up pretty well. What do you think about spirituality, the search for meaning, significance, purpose, belonging, all those kind of things that put in that category? What do most people think about that in Australia, America? Positives? Maybes? Negatives? Well, actually, again, too, the indication here is that most people think this is important now. It's not like it was like 20, 30 years ago. Most people actually think these things are important. And there's a huge search going on. It's often the largest section in your local bookstore. So in other words, it's a huge quest going on there. So most people would affirm it, and again in Australia it was thought as to be very, very important. The issue of church. What do you think that most Aussies, in your case, most Americans think about church? Positives? None? Maybes? There's some maybes there, and negatives, yeah? Now, folks, that's interesting, isn't it? Because actually most people, when asked, will come up with a similar kind of response, which is kind of ironic again, because we're the ones who are kind of pretty much leading that sucker, right? So if we don't think that we're doing a particularly good job, it's a bit disturbing. Truth is, back in my country, again, different reasons, very different to yours, but actually church comes up really badly. It was very bad. And I expected it to be so, but it was actually probably worse than what it was. So, most Aussies don't think church. I happen to have a great experience of church. I've never been to one I particularly didn't. I've always loved them, right? I feel very called to it, but most Australians, and I think most Americans, probably agree with me now. This comes up very bad. Now, I would say this. If you think about what's going on here, I would say this, from business speak, I would say, you've got a darn good product. The fundamentals of what you're on about, most people actually think are important. God, most people think he exists and is a significant part of their lives. Secondly, Jesus, who probably is considered the greatest person who ever lived, that you can work with. It doesn't understand all the claims of Jesus, but you can work with that. Spirituality, most people think it's important, the search and quest for meaning, significance, purpose, belonging. You can work with that. Here's the problem. Over here. And I would say if you're in business, you've got a darn good product, folks, that one has great resonance in your market, but your distribution system's in trouble. And if you don't change over here, you're going to be out of business very soon. And so where's the leverage for change? I've already hinted at the answer on that one. The leverage for change has to come about through changing the church, which we can change to a large degree. It is well within our responsibilities and our scope and capacities as leaders to change the church. And I suggest we need to do that. And here we enter into what is called, in technical terms, the issue of missional ecclesiology or missional church conversations. Missional church being the kind of church that is able to better deliver its message. That a church that defines itself by its mission and function in the world. It defines itself and organizes itself around the eternal purposes of God in and through his people. It becomes the defining, organizing principle by which how we organize ourselves. So that's the second concept, and I want you to just, again, put this to the back of your minds, and I'm going to put that, because I'll probably come back at these when I say God, Jesus, spirituality, church, right? So you just keep that there, and it's just in the background. The third concept actually came out of the NCLS stuff that I mentioned that before, right? So remember that we've ended up with the issue of church as being problematic. Let's assume we could take out, in my country, the traditional church is doing particularly badly. Let's say we take out all the seriously heavy, traditional, high church kind of folk. Now, I know there's people here, I'm not dismissing them, I'm just saying my country, in parts of my country, the mainline church is dying at 20% exponentially per annum. That's hemorrhaging. And the problem is that I would say it's it'll take a miracle to stop it. The problem is that most of these churches don't believe in miracles anymore, so I don't know how they're going to God can change it, but I don't know. It's not looking good. Let's just take them out of the equation for the moment, for the sake of analysis, okay? What have we got left? The church in my country that's carrying the biggest burden, and I know this is true for yours in some ways, of the mission of the church can be shaped like this. And you know it well because it's very well established now, called the contemporary church growth model. Megachurch would be an example of it, but contemporary church, of course, affects most of us. And I suspect you being here probably puts you in that camp somewhere because you're interested in all the paraphernalia of contemporary church, right? So let's say we take that and we put this up against our population in Australia, because this is, again, what was researched. Because the NCLS asked Aussies what they thought about churches like Hillsong. It was actually was asked. So now this is me guessing. Okay, I want to say what I'm about to say now is my take on it. I don't have the money to be able to research this out, but I think it's anecdotal and it's an educated guess. Okay, so let's say the church that's doing the best work in my country is the contemporary church. What appeal does that have to the population? Well, we discover that we know from our census that 3%, actually it's 2.8% of our population goes to church regularly, to evangelical. And I mean by evangelical, charismatic, Pentecostal, and kind of conservatives, all in one camp, right? 2.8% of our population self-identifies in that. So it's very, very small, okay? So this is not going to be attendance. I'm going to say this is cultural appeal. I would argue that the contemporary church model and everything it represents could probably reach into, generously, 12 to 15% of the population. It's not attendance. I said attendance is probably less than 3%. But I think there are the people in our population that would look at the contemporary church and say, I could go there. That has resonance with me. It's within my cultural orbit, if you will, going back to that thing at the top there. And I would say they would find it appealing. Now, I need to ask you over here, what do you think that would be for America? It's more than that, I think. Cultural appeal. We know attendance in your country, if you take the Pew report, Pew says it's about 18% every Sunday right across the board, including Catholics, the whole deal. So 18% of Americans, 18 out of 100 are in church on Sunday. So put that in there. What do you think the contemporary church model, its appeal is into your population? Now, I need you to shout out here. So you're saying 50? Is it 50? 20% over there? Just maybe one or two more? 38? That's kind of specific figure. And then whatever, okay. So usually the range is, and it depends on what part of the country you come from, but if you standardize it across, this is again anecdotal based on your experience, I'm going to be generous and suggest this, that it's probably about 40%. It's not attendance, folks, because attendance is not near that, not even close to it, okay? And if you put all attendance into all denominations, including the high church, it comes to 18%. So I think this is generous. You can even stretch it to 50% if you will. That's fine by me. Here's the thing, and I want to raise two issues, and this is what the point of what I'm about today is on about. I was a denominational exec for a number of years, probably about 12, paying for my sins, which were many. So let me speak from within mine, which is kind of like the independent Christian churches, right? Back in Australia. I headed up our church growth and leadership kind of section. So I'm going to say this from my experience again too, but again, I reflect on this from here. I think it's the same. Most of our churches, remember we took out the heavy high church ones, which we didn't in our setting have many of them anyway. So the rest of them, I would argue, felt that the kind of megachurch particularly was the answer to their problems. How do I know this? Well, many of them would go to Hillsong's national conference, which ended up having about 30,000 people a year, which is huge. In this country, it's big, right? In our country, it's like, whoa, it's a phenomenon, right? Everyone goes there. But I also know that our people were reading Hybels and Warren and every other book that has come out of your country, often written by people in successful megachurches, right? So I know that really they thought that was the answer. There's two problems that come out of this. The one problem is that if this is the answer, or seen as the answer, this over here is the answer for every church, that every church wants to become like Hillsong in order to be successful, even if they could do that, even if they could, which actually statistics are really against you in that regard. Even if you could do that, you're only going to reach 40% of the population. Does anyone see a problem there? It's called a strategic problem. That the only answer that you've got to the malaise or the challenge or the missionary challenge that is presented to us as American Christians in this time and place is a variation of church growth methodology and the church growth idea of church. If the only answer you've got is that, you're going to be in big trouble. It's a kind of intellectual poverty, and certainly a theological poverty in that. And I'm not having a go. I believe this carries the weight. And by the way, in your country, in the US, we know that from Leadership Network did statistics on this, that we know that the megachurch movement has grown, doubled in the last 12 years. We know that there are now 2,000 churches greater, cancel that, 1,200 churches greater than 2,000 in this country, in the last kind of major kind of check on that. 1,200 greater than 2,000. That doubled in 10 years, right? So it's a huge growing movement. The question I ask, and I think you should think about this anyway, how many churches you think are in America? Some would say up to 400,000. Let's say 350,000, all right? And the average size is 80. In other words, only very few folks, very, very few churches are ever going to have what it takes to be a megachurch in a successful way. Most of you are not going to get there. But the problem is most definitions of success are written from people within the megachurch. And that's a problem for us, folks, because it's the only answer we got. Now, I'm not saying they don't have an answer. I totally buy it, completely. But that can't be the only answer for the 300 and something thousand churches that have got to kind of find another way of being the church. Because whatever it takes to be a successful, effective megachurch, the combination of talent, time, resources, space, timing, all that stuff, it doesn't happen for most of us. And so we need to find another way of being that is more effective within the kind of, rather than simply copying what others are telling us to do, we need to learn to kind of think differently about ourselves. I'll come back at that now. That's the strategic problem, and it is a strategic problem. The other side of the equation is here, is among the 60%, which actually is really where my heart is more burdened for. What about the 60% of people out there who are not going to come to the church, even on your best Sunday, as sexy as you can make it, better worship, hotter stuff than ever you were able to do, even on your best day, 60%, 50% of Americans are not going to come to you. How are you going to reach them? What about them? What does church mean for them? How are they going to get in touch with the gospel if coming to your church is the only way they got to do it? That's a huge problem, folks, and I call this the missional or missionary problem. And it kind of is, I would suggest, a huge problem of our day. Because we know this much that we can't simply assume that whatever we're doing at this point is going to work over here. By the way, the NCLS guys did research on this. I'm returning back to their research. They did ask the question of people in our context what they thought about the Hillsong style church, right? The responses were like this. On the one hand, you had no, nay, never, that you don't go near those people, they'll ruin your life and take your children and mess with your money and all that stuff, right? So there's people in our context who say, no, right? That's an obvious one. The other one is what I call the blasé. Blasé, in my country, good on you, mate, not for me. It's not my cup of tea, right? But I'm glad for you. You know that kind of response. I don't know who's harder to reach, quite honestly. I'd rather go for the no-nay-never person, because at least they've got values and they believe in something. The blasé really are much harder to reach. And folks, the problem is that that's the range of response, if it's true in your country, that you have no to good on you, mate, not for me, good on you, buddy, not for me, then you've got a problem there, because they're not going to come no matter what you do. Anyone heard of blue and red oceans? This is a kind of, coming from the business world, they talk about red oceans being a very highly competitive sphere. And you've got to think of it like all competitors in the market are competing for the same slice of the market. Now that looks awfully like this over here, right? It's red ocean because if you think about it, all the sharks in the water, it's highly competitive, there's blood in the water. Everyone's going out after the same. There's something going on with that, is it? Everyone's going out after the same kind of slice of the pie. We're back on. How much didn't you see? This is what I want to know. I told you it's mad, Professor. How do I explain that? Did you see nothing of this, guys? Just the red stuff, okay. Whatever. So all this to say, well, I'm going to try and make sense now then of all this, in a red ocean, it's like this over here, where all the competitors are trying to become one to hit the same market. The problem is it's red water, blood in the water. And the problem is, as you know this very well, is that we compete with other churches for the same slice of the pie. What about the 60% of Americans, 50% if you will? What does church look like there? How are we going to go there, and how are we going to be the witnessing sent community in that kind of space? And that's a huge question. When you spend your money and resources, I want you to factor that in. Because if all of you are simply trying to become one of these over here, you still, even if you were super effective at it, and all of you became effective mega churches, you're not going to reach more than 40. Even if you say 50% of the population, not going to work. So it is a huge problem, and I want to, let us kind of dwell on that for a while. Let me say it this way. Einstein said this: the kind of thinking that will solve the world's problems must be of a different order to the kind of thinking that created those problems in the first place. The kind of thinking that will resolve the church's problems must be different to the kind of thinking that created those problems in the first place. From this we get our notion of organizational insanity, which I'm sure you've heard before. It goes something like this: trying to achieve significantly different results by doing the same thing better. You should do things better. I would say to those who are very good at megachurch, God bless you. Do it better. Make sure that next week is better than this week, which is one of your practices. Improve it. But you can't get significantly different results by doing that. You can only maximize what you're currently achieving. And in our sense of that, as we're losing ground every day in this country, in terms of the gospel's kind of entrenchment and the gospel's kind of reach, we simply cannot rely on the past formulas to kind of make it work for us. We simply have to think differently. Let me do this very visually for you if it's kind of a difficult kind of concept. If I wanted to dig a hole over there, would you agree with me that it's no good digging a hole here deeper? Not to keep digging over here. And yet, actually, that's what we do. We tend to go, because we get in, here's the problem. We get very invested in the hole that we've been digging, and particularly if you've been going at it for a long time. And particularly when all the kind of scripting that we've received affirms that this is the hole that we ought to dig. This is the only way you can dig. Which, again, I'd have to say, after centuries of thinking about church within a Christendom mode, has become our way of thinking. It's a mindset, folks. It's an idea of church. It's not the only way church can express. But we think it is, because there's a whole lot of theology books behind it, isn't it? So you can't call that into question without God taking you on. I would suggest that the church is the most flexible, It's a biblical, there's no such thing as a churchless Christian, but churches ought to be highly, highly responsive to their context, to a different context. I would hope a church in America is different to a church in Indonesia. It should be. You shouldn't simply export American churches as you wouldn't want simply an Indonesian church. In other words, churches ought to adapt to different cultural settings. And we simply can't just assume that what we've done before is going to apply again, assuming that you're going to get better results of that. So again, back to the analogy, it's no good digging the hole deeper here because we get vested. And the problem is you keep digging here, you get deeper into the hole, and you can't see your way out of it. And now you invested, you've spent half of your life digging this hole. You're telling that this is the wrong hole? I'm saying, no, it's one of the holes, but it's not the one that's going to be strategic. If you need to dig over there, get out and go there. And kind of exit your hole and go and start digging over there. And that's what we need some of us at least to do in our time. This is the meaning of the missional church. We're calling people what it means to be the good news among unchurched, genuinely unchurched people, and unchurched people who, for whatever reason, and you and I might disagree with them, but for whatever reason are not going to find their way to your churches. What does church look like for them? What is good news for those people? Actually, we suggest that I do a lot of training, I think, for Forge Mission Training Network. We train missionaries to the first world. So what does it mean to be a missional leader? So one of the first things we teach them is to say you go into a context, and from within that context you ask two fundamental questions. What is good news for them? Not presuming you know the answer until you get there. That means you have to look and observe. The person who discovered the stethoscope said this: listen to your patients, they're telling you the answer. We have to go into a listening mode and to observe what is going on in our culture beyond the walls of the church, where most of us have been highly churched, and begin to listen again to how people express their religious quests, how they express their longing, their brokenness, the existential issues that they face. Listen to those things, because then you bring the gospel's answer to it. Not presuming you've got a scripted answer that's going to easily apply, that they're going to understand. Listen to your patients. What is gospel? What is good news for them? You have to ask that question in the context. And the second one is this: what does church look like for them? We know that church is going to look different, necessarily different in that setting than it does in the settings we've become so used to. Because the research indicates that they're not going to come to the ones that we're doing. So we have to do it differently there. And that requires imagination, folks. And I say this all, and I'll sum up here, and we can go to Q&A. We stand at kind of that time in history, and we're one in those unique times that when a decision that is made has huge ramifications right across the line. It's a strategic time. Choices we make now will either determine the viability and success of the gospel in the US. I believe we now get to choose that. Decisions seriously made now will change the course of history, but it can go two ways. If you refuse to make the decision and to change, then we have to bear the consequences. And I want to warn you here, again, as the person who comes from your future, at least as far as churched contexts are concerned. If you do not change it now, you will become more like us in Australia. In 50 years' time, I mean, whether you disagree with Barna or not, he wrote the book Revolution a couple of years ago. It's kind of, I think, overstates the case somewhat. But he's based on research to some degree, to a great degree, says this: by 2025, the church attendance will have halved. Now, even if you say that's overstatement, there's something of a trend in that. And here's again from a person from your future. Trends, statistics like this, it feels like nothing at first, right? Let me do this. If you can take me, if this is still working. A trend like this is like you sitting here in America. You're over here at the moment. That would be the normal line. So you're feeling it like, we can take a hit or two, no problem, right? The problem is that most of your researchers, and every researcher that I'm aware of would affirm this, right? It's exponential. Decline, when it happens, doubles every X amount of years. And it begins to double up. So that by the time you get to 2025, according to Barna, you'll have 50% less attendance in your churches. You need to make decisions about that now. Decisions you make about plant and resources have to be done within a strategic framework, particularly in this time and this place in which you spend money, use resources, use tools wisely, but at least put them within the broader perspective of how you understand the kind of obligations of the mission of the church, a mission that only the church can do in representing and witnessing to the Lord Jesus Christ and to the kind of life that He's called us to live, that only we can do that. I want to, say, as you kind of spend up this week, and you should, keep that in mind. And tool yourselves with a kind of sense of the mission of the church, grander and bigger than the one we've currently got. So, yeah, let me open it up for Q&A at this point. I was finished 5 minutes behind. I believe there's so this lady over here, guys. There's microphones over here. Yeah, I should say there are microphones coming down either side with the lovely helpers. Gorgeous.
Thank you very much. Assuming I want to be I want to reach the 60%. What are some examples, if you jump in from strategic mode to tactic mode, that you've seen that you think are successful in other countries or here in America, that you want to give positive reinforcement, keep doing these things, and then you will get yourself out of this hole and start moving toward that one?
Well, in my country particularly, but it has a great resonance in this country, is what we might say is the Grassroots mission movement, incarnational mission, which takes the task of mission seriously, but also sees that, trying to develop new expressions of ecclesia or church in those settings. There's no doubt there's a huge movement in this country that is experimenting, that are taking the church out of the buildings that we know them and putting them into other settings. By the way, another good way is a lot of people doing it within businesses or meeting their communities in third places. I don't know if that means anything to you, but the third place is a very, very important place. That is, first place is our home, second place is our business, or our workspace, and then third place would be your preferential social environments. Now, there are tons of them around this city. They have got plant and resources, they've put all the money in, but they would more than likely welcome you with all your people and all that stuff, and you can basically give them the money and let them worry about the buildings. But you can then use their cafes or whatever it is. So there's a lot of people who are experimenting in those kind of things. Those are highly experimental. Some of the most exciting ones, this is that I'm involved with at the moment, called Future Travelers. It's mainly for mega churches at this stage, because we try to kind of select very carefully a group of very innovative leaders of missional churches mega churches, and see what it means to expand our notion of the church. Future Travelers is very interesting because we use the mega church as a platform. And by the way, I want you to hear me here. I'm not dismissing by any means the mega church. I work with it. I think it's a great platform to become movements. And we're seeing that out of the many of that, we've got about 35 churches through so far, very large, very, very successful churches that are really reinterpreting themselves as becoming movements and launching paths for mission to experiment way beyond their current way of doing it, beyond the multi-site into kind of incarnational mission. So very exciting. You can look at futuretravelers.org. I think there's information about it there. No, I am actually very, very hopeful in America, because again, this is the land of entrepreneurs. I hope so. I've kind of bet my life on it that you guys are going to get it and shrink wrap it and sell it to the rest of us at a profit. My question is just to make sure you get it right. Don't go gung-ho on us, right? Don't just kind of come up with, this is it. In other words, slow down a little bit and think very carefully about what you're doing. Then shrink wrap it and sell it to us. And I'm hoping you do that, actually, as American church. But I'm appealing to the entrepreneurial and innovative spirit that might be present in a room like this. And I would say that we're seeing some wonderful things happen in this country. I'm quite hopeful about the future, actually. 10 years ago, it wasn't the case. Any other questions? There's one in the back there, guys.
You're going to make me work for this one, aren't you?
Yeah, have his workout. He didn't have his workout this morning.
Really enjoyed the statistics that you were given as far as seeing the church growth, and the illustration that you did about if you got to dig a hole over here, why you continue digging here. And the statistics were the multi-campus church involved in those studies. And are you seeing a increasing in people coming to Christ and people being more committed to the cause of Christ because of multi-campus?
Yes. The multi-site was definitely, has definitely been a kind of extension. Actually, the logic in America is that you're a very highly franchised economy. If you look at most American streets, it's kind of littered with franchises that right across the country. You might call it generica. Actually, it's very much part of the American experience, a standardized experience. And I believe that the multi-site actually is a good example of how we've taken something that's successful and then formularized it to make it work in multiple settings. And I think it's a major advance, and it's moving in the direction of multiplication, because all of a sudden now, how do you reproduce the sucker becomes a huge, huge question. So I would say I'll affirm it very strongly. But fundamentally, nothing that we've done in church growth right across the board, 40 years of church growth, by the way, 40 years, if you go from McGavran, it's even earlier than that, it still has resided over the decline of the church in this country. In other words, church growth theory, including the megachurch, has not halted decline. It's done a lot to stop it. It's done its job, it's added its value to it, but it hasn't fundamentally turned the ship around. And again, that goes to highlight the fact that more of the same can't get fundamentally different results. You have to think and act differently. And I would say keep doing multi-sites, do it better. But you have to also begin to launch an experiment into the incarnational kind of camp. You have to learn what it means to be church and how it means to be the gospel people of God in different settings. And I suggest it's very hard to do it from your own space. You have to get there. Go among unbelievers, go where they go, hang out where they hang out. Ask questions that they dig into their hearts, try and find out what makes them tick, and articulate the community of faith into that, articulate ecclesia, church, into that experience. So that's kind of the missing link, by and large. It is increasing movement, as I've mentioned, but catalytic enough? Not quite yet. We need to see a whole lot more experimentation going on. But the multi-site's definitely a move in the right direction. Church planning movement has also been very exciting in America. Again, there's not enough of them, but it's been a very, very significant movement in strategic terms. Yeah. Well done. Someone else?
Great information, lots of numbers. Is this information available somewhere else where we can obtain it?
This information I just shared this morning?
Yeah, I don't have a little
Sorry?
book, etc.
Yes, there's the book. There's always a book, isn't it? You're asking an author about a book? Much of this, what I've shared this morning, is what we call the 60-40 problem. It's a very exciting the movement is Future Travelers, but the book is written with Dave Ferguson, who many of you might know. He and I wrote a book together called On the Verge, which articulates the change processes that we use for these large churches to help them become apostolic movements in our time. So On the Verge contains much of this. Actually, this conversation about 60-40 catalyzed it. Catalyzed that whole conversation, because for the first time some people saw, that's what those people who bug us with all their terminology mean. Is that what they mean by missional church? Church among the 60%? We can get that. And these very, very capable leaders have now begun to put their kind of resources in achieving that. And there's some very, very exciting things happening. So yeah, On the Verge would be the go-to book for what I've said this morning particularly.
Alan,
And again,
I've got a question way back here in the back. Way!
in the back,
The voice of the omniscient. No, go ahead.
Hey, Alan. Great talk. Really appreciate it a lot. Had a question about the four categories: God, Jesus, spirituality, and church. And there. Hi.
There you are.
Over here.
Okay, right.
Hi.
It was the Lord speaking to me.
Okay, so I know part of it is we just do church badly sometimes, and we annoy people, especially non-believers. Okay, but how much of it is there also a factor too that when you talk about God, Jesus, spirituality, you're talking about really generic, vague kind of categories, and then once you kind of concretize that,
Yes, absolutely.
and become an institution,
It's an easy target, yeah?
yeah, and we live in a very Gnostic culture where
Yeah.
people they just don't like that. So how much of that is
Yeah.
kind of factors outside of our control?
Yeah,
it's just kind of a
absolutely.
cultural mood.
I totally agree. I mean, like I often think of the church as a big dancing bear act, isn't it? We're all clunky and we're trying to get it done, you know. It's just made up of human beings, which is broken to some degree. And but But be it as it may, whether we can say it's legitimate, we're a human community, we're going to have our faults, the perception matters at this point hugely, because it's not so much what we want people to believe about us, but it's how people perceive us, and perception is reality in the world in which we live. So we still have a perception problem. We've got a PR problem, a huge one, where most people don't feel that churches are wholesome or welcoming, or we often come forth as judgmental, all the things that people dismiss us for. There is some truth to it, and we need to wear it, and probably apologize and confess our sins. And we're not being the kind of people that Jesus intended us to be all the time. And yeah, I think people will forgive humanness if you're kind of a bit more humble about it. So I think sometimes we come forth as quite uptight kind of folk, and I think it's kind of done us terrible damage over the long term. But fair to say we're an easy target. The church is there, you can always have a go. But the problem is the church has also been so much part of, I was born in South Africa, the church founded apartheid and sustained it over so many centuries, at least a century of it. Yeah, that was wrong. There's no way of saying it. I mean, it was wrong. So we need to sometimes own up to our historical sins. But it's a fair comment. Thank you for that.
Alan, I think we've got time for maybe one or two more. So here's the gentleman right here.
Yes.
I think he started touching on another model right here that I've gotten to be a part of 2 megachurches over the last 14 years. The reason they became megachurches and are still growing is because they went out into the community and reached the community and redefined what the community thought of the church, just what you're talking about there.
And the megachurch absolutely was a movement. Its roots back in the 60s, like I said, with McGavran's kind of thinking, but really came to its flower as a kind of really contextualization of the church in middle-class America, and was very good at it, probably largely among so like I say, middle-class suburban kind of experience. The problem is we've used up that market now, and it's pretty saturated, and that would be the issue. So the time is now for the megachurch to think bigger. I often say to my future traveler companions, I say, we're not saying shrink your idea of church. No. We're actually saying broaden it out.
Absolutely.
Keep doing what you're doing, but add so much more to it. Put some effort into R&D, research and development and innovation, and expand outwards. And everyone becomes an agent of the king. So we're saying movement thinking, everyone has the capacity for world transformation in them. Every one of us in the church is a church in the making. That's a different way of thinking about church and creating audiences that we have to entertain. So I think it's now the next biggest things that we have to do is to activate the people of God, which is the biggest secret weapon in God's hands, I would argue, to activate the people of God into the equation. That everyone is an agent of the king and ought to be released as such. Every single believer carries the potential for world transformation. In a seed is a potential for a tree. In a tree is a potential for a forest. In a spark is a potential for a flame, and a flame is a potential for a forest fire. It's all contained in potential in the smallest part. And I would argue that God's people are a huge missing piece in the equation. That's one of the things we teach very strongly in the mega church, is to activate everyone into the equation. Yeah. So, yeah.
One more. You are the lucky, I hope this is a good one, man. A lot of pressure.
Going back even further from the 60-40, you mentioned that in Australia you said only about 12 to 15 were possibly church attenders. Was it ever larger than that? And if so, what do you perceive was the cause of the shrinking of that percentage?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'd say like it's a cultural appeal. It's interesting, Australia, while actually nominally a Christian nation because we came from the European experience, has never had a kind of church experience like America. Just to give you the difference is that both our countries were colonized by people who came from the old country, England, largely. You guys came out on the ships and you had a prayer meeting on the beach. There were people who were trying to escape from the religious oppression of the heavy religious people and sought religious freedom and liberty, right? Our mob were kind of rounded up, mainly Irish vagabonds and pickpockets, hungry people, largely, some criminals, but they were petty criminals, rounded up, put onto boats against their choice, and sent down as kind of slave labor. The first thing that they did, and they landed on the beaches, there were 4 or 5 boats. There were about 8 guys to 1 woman. They said, okay, they handed the women around, had a kind of mass rape, terrible scene, and then said, get to work. And you can see the difference in our country in terms of our stance towards the church. The first governor of New South Wales, which is our first colony, was the Anglican minister on Sunday, and he was the guy who whipped and hung them during the week. So he was the governor. He was also happened to be the judge so he was all these 3 things, but it gave a really wrong signal to the role of Christianity in our country. So we have a whole host of reasons that's very much harder. But I would argue, America will always have a strong association with the church. In comparative terms, you're not Europe, you don't have Europe's experience, but definitely the trend is away from the church, veering away. The unchurched population is now becoming more de-churched. De-churched is becoming unchurched, I should say. When Hybels and them were talking about unchurched, I honestly don't know if there's such a thing as an unchurched person in America, at least then. Most people had a born again in the family and had an experience directly of the church. Not many unchurched people. De-churched is huge. Now you're increasingly experiencing genuinely people who have got no connection with the church. That's our territory. When you're among unchurched people, you have to begin to act like a missionary. I don't know if I answered that question that well, but thanks for it.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, will you show your appreciation for Alan Hirsch? Thank you.